Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Thank you. Thank you. I love Pacifica. It's so nice. So we have a number of dignitaries who are here that I'd like to welcome and introduce. Our supervisor, David Pine, is here. Dave? And I believe we have 3 of our city council members here. Sue DeGritty. Sue, where are you? Deidre Martin. And Sue Gauderhouse. So, anything been going on? We thought we would kick off the new year here in Pacifica because a year ago yesterday, we had our first town hall in the new administration, and we had it at the Little Brown Church, and there was this overflowing crowd. And it made me realize then that I had a lot of work to do last year. So we had 11 town halls last year, in-person town halls. And I believe the largest town hall gathering in the country took place in that little town down the road from you in Half Moon Bay, where we had 1,900 constituents come out in a town of 12,000. So it's great to kick it off here again in Pacifica, and there's a good 350 of you here this morning. So we're going to answer all of your questions in the next hour or so. But I thought we would start off with a retrospect of 1 year of President Trump. Look at his desk. He's probably got golf balls in his pocket. Anyway, okay, so let's go to the first slide. So, have we advanced our U.S. foreign policy in the last year? Well, we had a president who issued inflammatory threats against North Korea and said the fire and fury that will be visited on you is nothing short of remarkable. He decertified the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal, and that is in process now of being looked at. Now, mind you, if that were to be decertified permanently, we would be basically inviting Iran to re-engage in developing nuclear warheads, and I don't see how that is a positive undertaking. He has undermined the two-state solution by basically saying on different occasions, well, I'm for a two-state solution, I'm for a one-state solution, and then very recently announced that we're moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which then makes the Palestinians unwilling to negotiate at all. And then the State Department's been hollowed out. There's been a reduction or a reluctance to hire, and about 30% of the State Department now is devoid. There's just not people in those roles. And then he's created a fair amount of disharmony with our NATO allies by basically not saying that he was going to commit to being there for them. It took him a long time to finally say that Article 5 would be something that he would support. And so that's our foreign policy. It's been rather destructive, I might say. Okay, let's look on to protecting women's health. So he scaled back the Obamacare enforcement, reinstated the global gag rule, disbanded the White House Council on Women and Girls, rescinded Obama-era Title IX guidance for sexual assault on college campuses, and Betsy DeVos doesn't get it, wants to allow employers to deny women insurance coverage for birth control, and created a new Health and Human Services division to allow healthcare providers to refuse care. Pretty astonishing, isn't it? Okay, next slide. Environmental protection. Well, took us out of the Paris Climate Accord, approved Dakota access and Keystone pipelines, authorized resumption of offshore oil drilling, attacks on public lands, more drilling and shrinking the monuments, and then recently repealed the chemical disclosure regulations for fracking. It's really astonishing to see how much destruction one man could undertake, frankly, without the support of Congress in many of these circumstances, and do so in such a short period of time. Okay, next one, immigration turmoil. So within weeks, within days actually, of being sworn in, he imposed the travel ban, he repealed the Dreamers Protection that had been put in place by President Obama, but now says he's sympathetic, and now we're in the middle of that crisis. There's about 122 Dreamers who lose their status every single day in this country. He's restricting family reunification to only parents and their children, so no grandparents, no cousins, restricting H-1B visas, and restricting diversity visas. Ethics. Yeah, this is probably one of the most disheartening elements of this presidency. He says he was going to release his tax returns and then has refused to do so. He's used the office of the presidency for personal profit. The emoluments clause, which I know you're all now familiar with, is something that prevents the president from benefiting from anything in terms of gifts or financial reimbursement or remuneration by foreign persons, and yet they're all staying at the Trump Hotel. Every time he goes to Mar-a-Lago, and he goes 3 or 4 times a month, it's $3 million just for him to go down there. And he has had 91 golfing outings in the last year, and they've spent over taxpayers, all of us, have spent over $150,000 on golf carts at Mar-a-Lago. Within weeks of becoming president, he received approval for 38 trademarks from China. One of them was for an escort service, I might add, Trump escort service. Does that surprise you? There is a growing concern that he is engaged in obstruction of justice. And I'm sure you're aware of what happened earlier this week when the White House counsel McGahn threatened to quit if he fired Special Counsel Mueller. He refused to put his financial holdings in a blind trust like virtually every other president has done before him. He has family members working in the White House, which is illegal, has been illegal since after Jack Kennedy left office, but since he's not paying them, they continue to have those positions in high authority within the White House. And he's made more than 2,000 misstatements, you like the way I use that, during his first year. Okay, some good news. The one good thing that happened last year for this district is that we were able to extract from the Department of Transportation $647 million to electrify the Caltrain between San Jose and Seattle. So, does that make you feel good? All right. So, I want to tell you that this last year has been pretty daunting for me, and I know for you. But one thing that we have to remember is that this is not normal, and it cannot become the new normal. I was sitting with a couple of girlfriends the other night. We spent half of the time together talking about the president. Now, our blood pressure can't afford this. So we have to, I think, very deliberately stay informed, but not allow it to consume our every waking hour. And the cable TV channels, all of them, seem committed to making sure that's all we do. So I want you all to go see one of the nominated movies for an Academy Award this afternoon and not turn on the TV. So, as you know, I serve on the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee. The Intelligence Committee has consumed most of my days in Washington because we literally have gone down to what's called the SCIF, which is a secure facility to interview countless people to investigate whether or not the Russians interfered in our election and to what extent, and whether or not the Trump campaign, in coordination with the Russians, attempted to interfere in the election. So we've interviewed countless people now. And the one thing that is perfectly clear to me, and should be to each of you, is that Russia intends to interfere in our elections in 2018, in 2020, and into the foreseeable future unless we put them down. Now, how do we put them down? Well, probably the most important thing we can do in the near term is shift from the various election machines we've been using, all of which I have no confidence in, to paper ballots, optical scanning, and audits. Now, all of which that can be done. We already know that the Russians interfered into our elections in manners that we have never ever seen before. They hacked into the DNC. They hacked into John Podesta and lots of other people's emails. They used RT, Russia Today, which is their propaganda machine, and was spewing out their particular perspective. They got onto Facebook and Twitter, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for ads. They created websites, tens of thousands of websites and Twitter accounts to identify groups that they could then attempt to manipulate and to convey messages as well. They also hacked into 22 states' voting records. Now, when the intelligence community assessment came out in January of last year, they said that there was consensus and high confidence that the Russians had interfered in the election. They also said they did not believe that the Russians had been able to get into the voting machines. So I kind of took that at its face. But then subsequently, there was a convention in Las Vegas called DEF CON. And I guess it happens every year. I wasn't familiar with it before. But they're hackers that come together and hack. And last year in January, they had purchased 10 election machines, voting machines. And then they were going to try and hack them. The first one was hacked into before the opening session was over. And before the weekend was over, all 10 machines had been hacked into. So I then reached out to one of the organizers and had him come back to Washington and give a briefing to members. And he said something truly profound. I said, you know, the intelligence community says there's no evidence that they hacked into the actual voting machines. And he looked at me and he said, there's no way that they would know. Now there's 4 companies that make these machines. Every city, county, or state that contracts with them has to sign a document that says that they will not try to red team it, which means they won't test it to see whether or not you can hack into it. So you have software that's never tested. You have machines that are really never evaluated, and I don't think we can have confidence in them. So that's where I want to spend my energy, and when the final investigation is over, my hope is that we will have spent some time, which we have spent no time on yet, trying to come up with recommendations on what we should do relative to the security of our election system. Because the Russians are here, and they will continue to do everything they can to promote their agenda. So, with that bit of good news, what I think I'll do is just open it up to questions you have, and we have one microphone over here. So if you want to start lining up, we will take your questions, and I'm going to take a seat. So I guess one person is actually taking the time to type out their question, and Brian's going to read it.
This is from Laura Yap. Do you feel our institutions are sufficiently protecting our democracy at this time? I'm concerned about the attacks on the press, our judiciary, and the FBI, and wondering what we can do as citizens.
You know, that's kind of the question of the hour, I think. Because in many respects, they are under attack. How many of you have found yourself using the term fake news? I mean, it's become part of our vernacular now. The press is absolutely critical to this democracy. And we have got to respect the fact that there are different points of view that will be represented, but they all must be represented. Now, we all have an obligation to make sure that we look for facts. And there are lots of websites that exist that you can access to determine whether or not what's being said is truthful. And then you have an obligation, as I have an obligation, to speak truth to power and to put down false statements and claims. Now, the FBI is being viciously attacked right now by the chairman of the Intel Committee and the Republicans generally, because their intention is to shut down the Mueller investigation. They've kind of moved on from the investigations that are going on in the House and the Senate. They want to shut down the Mueller investigation. So last week, unbeknownst to the Democrats on the committee, they surprised us with this motion to approve a document that they had crafted. It was a memo that they wanted to make available to all members of Congress. Now, in a classified setting. The memo was based on a super classified document that only the chairman and the ranking member had seen. So how could we support promoting a document the underlying basis of which we had not even read or interpreted. But the chair, Mr. Nunez, had interpreted it to his liking and came up with a memo with talking points that reflect his position, but do not reflect the underlying classified document. So it is filled with misstatements, and I would go as far as to say lies. And not only did they want to make it available to all the members of the House, they wanted to make it public and declassify it because it is a script for what the president wants to promote in terms of shutting down the Mueller investigation.
This is like watching CNN, you know. This is all narrative, nothing but a narrative.
We have a whole
If you have a
line.
question, you can get in line. Okay,
Let's take the first one. Yeah.
so
Thank you.
So thank you for being here and having 11 town halls. And I just want you to know, we know you're representing us in Congress. We've got your back too. And I'll be very quick because there's a lot of people here. But in the continuing resolution, there was another tax cut that undermines the Affordable Care Act. And I wonder if you can speak to the sort of erosion of funding for that, even as we have, quote, continuing resolutions.
So in the tax cut legislation that was signed, it did away with the insurance tax, which insurers are required to pay to help fund the Affordable Care Act. So even though the Affordable Care Act wasn't repealed after 64 attempts, there are efforts underway right now to reduce the length of time that you could sign up for the Affordable Care Act, completely reduce the marketing that went on a federal level. Surprisingly, here in California, the Covered California program did very well because they also invested, I forget how many millions of dollars into the marketing, and so they've actually seen an increase in participation. So there'll be efforts underway to discourage participation and to kill it with 1,000 cuts, and that's what's underway through the tax cut bill and through the continuing resolution. Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am very, very interested in the environment and climate change, and I want to commend your support for the sea level rise initiative here in San Mateo County. I think that's very, very important for adaptation. But I'm also concerned about mitigation, which is minimizing the impact of global warming and climate change. Can you tell me what you're doing to help address that?
So my efforts are local. I've worked with Dave Pine, who is here, on the whole issue of sea level rise. I must tell you, I don't think we're moving fast enough. And all the cities in the county have been informed, and we've had a series of meetings, and I frankly think that the only way forward is for us to create a flood control district so that we can prepare for what will be 3 to 5 feet of sea level rise over the next century. Now, no one likes to see themselves taxed, right? But this is about retaining our homes and all of the services and the sewage treatment centers that we rely on, all of which are located along the bayside. And I think that we are losing opportunities to access federal dollars. Santa Clara has a flood control district, and they get lots of federal dollars that we don't get to access. So you're going to hear me over the next year talking more about what we have to do. And I would be one of those that would like to see us put something on the ballot and get it passed, even if we don't have the support of individual cities, because it's too important. And your property values are going to be impacted over time. There's no question about it. So we've got to be prudent. We shouldn't be acting after the fact. We should be doing so before the fact. Jurisdictions are taking steps. Foster cities taking steps. The airport's taking steps, San Mateo's taking steps. I think Pacifica has certainly looked at the issue as well.
Hi, my name's Peter Gisella. I have two specific questions for you, and you can answer yes, no, or maybe. I spoke to Jason Ham 2 weeks ago on Friday, January 12th, for 20 minutes on the phone, and he wasn't able to give me any clarity on these questions. Question one, a reporter on October 17, 2017 for the Washington Times did an article on Chairman Thornberry's Department of Defense request from 2016 on the Selective Service System's future, and Chairman Sessions' request about including women in the registration process. He also provided a PDF copy titled Report on the Purpose and Utility of the Registration System for Military Selective Service. On the cover of the page, it states it was, quote, generated on 2017, March 17. This month, a GAO did an analysis of this report, and it referenced the date as July 27th, July 2017. My question is this March 17 report the final report, which would be before you had your markup question and vote about including women in the Selective Service Program, or was it a preliminary report and the final report came out in July? I've not been able to clear that up. My second question.
Okay, as to your first question, that's way too complex for me to answer here. We'll take it and we'll respond to you directly in writing. So
The second one looks like it's going to be equally
All right,
complex.
I'll summarize it. In 2010, I saw you at the Commonwealth Club, and I asked you about Pete McCluskey's bill from 1979 to move the registration process for men and women to age 17th birthday in order to facilitate a one-year discussion while most of them are in high school about community service, military service. Would you be willing to explore the possibility of reintroducing this idea so that McCain's two-year commission that are looking at topics like this can have a point of reference on it, and speak to Congresswoman McSally, who is also a Republican on the Armed Service Committee, about co-sponsoring such an idea?
okay, so I will look at that. You should all know that I believe that we should have universal conscription. I think women should be included as well. I think there should be a commitment for every young adult to give 1 year of service to the country on some level. So that's not fully embraced, but I think it would be good for our country and good for our young people and good for their parents to feel like they have something at stake. Less than 1% of the population in this country is in the military now. And so no one pays a lot of attention to how much money we're spending, how many lives are at stake, how swift we are to incite activities in foreign lands, and I don't think that's good for us. So I will look into it. Okay, next question. Pardon me? And transgender, yes. Actually, I've carried the legislation to make sure that the military supports transgender participation.
Good morning. First off, I want to thank you for your hard work and unwavering dedication to our community here in Pacifica. Secondly, I wanted to know, have you considered or are you interested in running for presidential election in 2020?
I love you, but not enough to run for president.
Somebody's going to have to clean up this mess that we're in now.
No, I said, no, I'm not running.
Thank you, Representative Speier. I just want to thank you for calling this meeting our secret society. And I just want to make a suggestion before I ask my question real quick. As a millennial, we're kind of tied to our phones, and this last year showed that politics is moving towards social media. And I'm wondering if maybe we could make social media for politics, maybe having sections that are just for voters on Facebook or something. You can do the work with them to make it user-created questions and then online town halls from your office. And that'd probably be a lot cheaper than getting everybody together.
So we're doing that right now.
Yeah.
So we do Facebook Live.
And I do watch you on Facebook Live, and I want to say thank you very much for that. As far as my question goes, I just want to say that history is full of examples of great civilizations collapsing due to the greed of a few. I believe citizens united in gerrymandering are far worse for democracy than this Russia collusion gate, I guess. And the results are going full steam ahead. $500,000 from Richard Koch alone to Paul Ryan the very next day after the stick tax bill passed. Pretty good investment for a reported $1 billion they're supposed to get from the tax bill. Many GOP congressmen openly talked about how they had to pass the tax bill or their donors would stop donating. Trump administration is just obvious with the corruption, as you have mentioned. I wonder why they waived the criminal sanctions for the Deutsche Bank just recently, too. Okay, sorry. Our choice is coming down to rich politicians that we hope represent ourselves, or politicians that represent rich people. And I wonder how much corruption is happening behind the scenes that we don't see, that we don't hear about. Is it as bad as we're made to believe? Is there any way back? Are we going into an oligarchy, like I keep hearing people talk about? Thank you.
It's a very sobering question. And I think it's why you're all here and why we all fear that things are going in the wrong direction and why we have to stay alert. I mean, this is not a sport that doesn't require participation. You don't get to sit on your sofa and watch what's going on anymore. I am standing on my left foot right now without a brace, even though I should have my brace on, because I tore 2 tendons because I was walking precincts. So we've all got to be willing to get out there and maybe even suffer a little pain to make sure this democracy is here tomorrow. So to your question about corruption, there are people that can be corrupted in government, but the government itself is not corrupt. It's people in it that from time to time are corrupted from it. The money in politics is still obscene, and until we're willing to go to public financing of elections, we're going to continue to pay that price. So I urge you to embrace that fact that public financing is in your best interest and in my best interest. I should not have to sit on the phone and make phone calls for campaign money when I should be studying the next national defense organization.
Hi, my name is Aaron. Our Kurdish allies in Syria against ISIS are under attack by our NATO ally, Turkey. What can be done to protect them?
Well, the question about Turkey being a NATO ally is a question, really. I think that there's things I can't tell you that I think would reflect that we recognize that the Kurds have been our ally in many respects. And I think that we can never lose sight of that. But I can't really tell you any more than that.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thanks for being here. I just don't understand if it's a political thing going on in Congress with the Freedom Caucus and Paul Ryan's people, but we have an attorney general that lied under oath in the Senate and a president who is violating all of these emoluments clauses and things, and people getting security briefings that lied on their forms. And is nothing being done because the GOP's in power? I mean, is there... it's really discouraging that they can disregard all the laws, but we can get locked up for jaywalking. I mean, it's... What's up?
Well, hopefully you can't get locked up for jaywalking, but... So, there is a price to be paid when there isn't a check on political power. And we have the House and Senate, the White House, and the judiciary really in the control of the Republicans. So anything we do can be shot down. The ethics director actually left office because he saw so many violations, and he kept writing to the White House and asking for documents and indicating that they were violating them, and they just basically ignored it, so he just resigned. So in terms of the Attorney General lying, I think he has such a serious case of amnesia that every time he was asked a question, he says he would always couch it in such a way so that it wasn't specifically a lie, as much as I can recall. So there was enough of a caveat that I think he probably, if an action was brought against him for perjury, it probably would not be sustained because he was smart enough to kind of couch his terms. You know, if you can't recall, quote unquote, then you can't be held, even if subsequently they find out that you had said something or done something. So I think what we need to do is just make sure that there's more balance in Congress right now. There is no balance. It's just all one-sided. The tax bill went through. There wasn't one effort to negotiate with the Democrats because they didn't need the Democrats. So it was a tax bill, 83% of which will go to the wealthiest 1%. And by the way, since I'm mentioning that, next Thursday night at the College of San Mateo Little Theater, if you haven't had enough today, we're going to have a specific town hall on the new tax law. And I'm going to have a tax attorney and CPA there who has read the law backwards and forwards and who will be able to give us a perspective on how it's going to impact us here in California.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I'm with Indivisible, San Francisco, and Pacifica Resist. A couple of months ago, we unsuccessfully tried to introduce an impeachment resolution to the Pacifica City Council. It failed. It didn't get voted down, but it failed to pass partly because Mayor O'Neill said that you told him, this might have been unwittingly, that if we pass an impeachment resolution, we'll lose nearly $1 million in federal funding. So I'd like to ask you about that first of all. And then secondly, this so-called president violates the Constitution on a daily basis. He fails to take care to uphold the laws of this country, and he's quite clearly abusing his power and breaching the public trust, which are impeachable offences. So the second part of the question is, there is an impeachment resolution in the House that Brad Sherman and Representative Cohen introduced. I'd like to know why you're not supporting it at this point, because he's impeachable on a daily basis. And the third part of this is, at the very least, if Mueller is fired or removed from office, will you say publicly that you'd regard it as an impeachable offence? Thanks.
Okay, so your first question, it wasn't on impeachment, I think it was on sanctuary cities that Mayor O'Neill referenced that he had talked to my office.
No, he said that at the impeachment hearing at the City Council, specifically.
Well, I didn't have a conversation with him, and I don't know that Brian had a conversation with him on whether or not sanctuary cities should be embraced in Pacifica. And I think what Brian said to him was basically, eyes wide open, we are trying to get you federal funds for all of the work along the ocean, and it could be impacted. So that was my only concern. In terms of why I haven't supported the impeachment measures so far, I'm serving on the Intelligence Committee. We're doing the investigation, so I don't want to prejudge the results of that at this point. If Robert Mueller, the special counsel, comes down with findings that are, in my view, impeachable, absolutely I will support it. Right now, what I'm supporting is the 25th Amendment. I think I've spent a lot of time on this part of the issue. The 25th Amendment allows for the removal of the president for incapacity. And all it requires is that the vice president, in conjunction with the majority of the members of the cabinet, make that determination. And in so doing, they write a letter to the House and the Senate, and immediately the vice president becomes the acting president. And then and I know people say, but gosh, Pence is so much worse. Let's be clear. The potential for our men and women to lose their lives in a war that could be avoided under this presidency is so much higher than it would be under a Pence presidency. And we have got to recognize that that risk exists. So, the reason why the 25th Amendment is valuable is that it happens immediately. It puts the onus on the Vice President of the Cabinet to be alert as well and watchful. Now, there's a book that's been released called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. And I actually met with the editor and spoke to one of the contributors to the book. And it's 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts who have contributed to this book. And when the editor, who's a professor at Yale University, she's a tenured professor, her specialty is violence. She was alarmed by what she saw after the election, and this book evolved. She says, the mental health of the president is really not what she is focused on. What she's focused on is the mental health of the American people, which was an interesting way of putting it. But it's really an interesting read. A malignant narcissist is someone who suffers from a lot of maladies, not just narcissism, but antisocial behavior. Antisocial behavior is behavior where you get your kicks out of putting people down. How often does that happen right now? Paranoia, fair amount of that. So as you see, there's some, I think, evidence to suggest that he does not have the capacity to do this job. And so I want to keep pushing the 25th Amendment. The impeachment resolution is not something I'm prepared to do at this point in time.
Hello, I wanted to thank you for representing our district here and also allowing this time of free speech, because that's not allowed in a lot of places and a lot of countries do not allow free speech. But thank you for supporting women who have been sexually intimidated by their employers or by Hollywood directors or by people in power. And thank you for continuing to stand up for those people who are being attacked by their bosses.
So let me just thank you for that comment. When I'm asked, can you work with the Republicans? I say yes. And the Me Too Congress Act that I introduced late last year has now been incorporated in toto into a bill that will be on the House floor next Tuesday. My name off of it. Now I'm a co-author of it, but that's what happens when you're not in power. But let me just tell you what this bill does. It provides that any person in a congressional staff can file a complaint with this Office of Compliance. There is no longer going to be this mandatory 30 days of legal evaluation. There's no longer a mandatory mediation. There's no longer a cooling off period. The victim will be immediately represented by counsel, paid for by Congress, because historically what would happen is that the member or the harasser was represented by government-paid lawyers, and the victim was on their own. There isn't this mandatory mediation. There's going to be an office that's going to actually have the power to investigate and to use subpoena. If there is a settlement and it's a member, the settlement will be paid by the U.S. Treasury, and the member will be required to, within 90 days, reimburse the U.S. Treasury or have their salary garnished, their thrift plan garnished, and their Social Security garnished. It is disgusting what I've had to listen to for the last 3 months in Congress. The fact that members think that they have the ability to abuse their staff and sexually harass them and get away with it, which is what was going on before. They weren't identified. Oh, by the way, they will be identified. The fact that John Conyers, the Dean of Congress, who'd been there for over 45 years, 84 years old, the ranking member on Judiciary, had a string of sexual harassment cases that were settled, which taxpayers picked up the tab. Within 3 weeks, he was out of there. Now, so that is an issue that we have come together, both Republicans and Democrats. This bill is going to be on the House floor on Tuesday, and will pass, and then we'll wait for the Senate to take action. The parts that we can actually implement without Senate approval will go into effect very quickly. But we're not just changing the culture of Congress, we're changing the culture in the United States as it relates to how we treat women.
Thank you for your service, Jackie. He's so offensive and crude when you see film clips of him. What is your one-on-one interaction with him like? If you're in a meeting where he's there,
I have not been in the same building. Well, I've been in the same building with him. He's come to Congress a few times, but I have had no interaction with him at all. And we have this holiday gala every year, which is like the one event that's kind of a perk in the job, and you get dressed up in a long gown and black tie, and you go to the White House, and there's music and there's dinner. I didn't go last year.
Pleasure to come out here and see you this morning, Jackie. My question is, when I saw what Mueller, the McCox was standing up for what was right, and if Trump had to back off filing Mueller, and he interviewed a bunch of people, Mueller's got that on the record. That should be your evidence to impeach. Okay, I understand where you're coming from, but if you can take back the House, I think that should be your first priority. You have overwhelming evidence. There's a new movie out. I'd suggest everybody in this room go see it. It's at Tan Fran Cinema. It's called The Post, and you'll understand what we're talking about. Jackie, thank you very much, and I wait for your comment.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a section in the movie The Post where they're kind of focused on Richard Nixon, who says, and I'm telling you, I don't want the Washington Post to ever be allowed in the White House again, not the photographers, not, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's already happened. All right, next question.
Okay, actually, I tried to make this short. Somehow it's kind of difficult. But anyway, I think, if you look at the whole issue, I think the issue is deeper. basically I look back to the U.S. history. Let's just look at for 50 years. I see a repetitive pattern that this country has been involving in invading other countries, regime changes for worse, supporting terrorists, and suppressing freedom fighters. Just like one of the gentlemen just brought up, why are we allowed the Turks to suppress the, actually, we have been supporting the Turks to genocide the Kurds in the 90s. I mean, tens of thousands got killed. So the question, I think, is deeper. It's not just parties, not just because of one party, it's because this country's foreign policies is controlled by a group of people, maybe oligarchs, imperialists, that continue to perform this kind of damaging things to the world and using US tax dollars money. I think we'd like to elect somebody who's really free of that. I mean, like just from the grassroots, I mean, without any money. I mean, I'm willing to run for that, actually. Actually, I'm running for the US Senate this year, and I will make things much better. So I wish and I hope, and Jack Speier can support me too. Okay.
Thank you for holding numerous town halls in our district. And you've done much more than the other members of Congress in this, and we really appreciate residents here and a member of the Indivisible SF group as well. And I had a couple questions. I saw an article on the Washington Examiner that said that and we appreciate your supporting voting no on the tax plan and supporting DACA. But this article said that you are willing to work with the president on the wall issue. And our country was established on immigration, and it's made great by immigration. All the wonderful inventions that we have, and the wealth that's generated here is based on people coming from the founding fathers onward. So, one of the reasons we have illegal immigration here is because our policies and our procedures to come into the country takes years and years. And if somebody can fill out a quick form, get vetted really quickly, there's no reason for anybody to come here illegally. So I'm wondering, what you're doing to make the process a lot easier. It seems like that's a solution. Is we need to open our country, not close our door. And second question is a local one about the airport, and I've asked you this before. But in the last 6 months since we've talked, I've noticed the airplanes are more often louder, and now I'm actually smelling the exhaust fumes blowing in from the ocean as the airplanes are going across. And I'm thinking, boy, if they're that loud and you can smell them, God help us if they lose an engine, because they're probably going to be in the top of the hill up there, north Pacifica. So, please let us know what you're doing.
All right, that was a long question. Why are you reading the Washington Examiner? Is my first question. So the Washington Examiner took it from a CNN or an MSNBC interview I did, and I was asked about DACA, and I said, I feel so strongly that we owe these DACA kids the opportunity to stay here and build their lives here, that if I have to trade a couple of $1 billion so the president can have his phony wall for a year, I'll do it. That was what I had said. Because we can't, we have basically created an environment where these kids now are identifiable. And if we don't fix it so they can stay here permanently, become US citizens, we've got a target on their backs. And you can't have 800,000 or 600,000, whatever the number is today, in that situation. So I guess if that's how they interpret it, so be it. But that's what I said and what I meant. As for the airport noise, we've been working on this issue now for a year and a half. We have the FAA that's agreed to some of the recommendations we made. My biggest concern is the nighttime flights. And we've got them committed to reducing them and taking the planes out of the bay, turn left at the Golden Gate Bridge, and then down the coast, or turn right and go down the bay. So it's not flying overhead at nighttime. So that's, I guess, is it 11 to 6 or 12 to 5? But they haven't fully implemented it yet. And it's going to take some time for it to become fully implemented. But what is interesting and notable is that in 2000, we had as many flights as we have today. But in 2001, after 9/11, the number of flights declined dramatically. And so for the next 10 years or so, the flights were down, and then they started to move up again. So there's only been a 6% increase in the number of flights from 2000, from the year 2000. But it's a 20% increase if you look at the years in between to now. And that's, you know, one of the prices we pay for living near an airport and in an economy that is booming. Now, we can't put curfews in place because the law that was passed in 1990 actually precludes imposing curfews. But we're working with the FAA so that we can at least limit the noise at night, because it is not, it's unhealthy for people to have to live with that kind of noise and breaking up their REM at night.
Hi, Congressman Speier. My name is Steve Shamo. I'm here with my wife Judy. We're from San Mateo. I have a question about the Intelligence Committee. So you said that you're a member of this committee, and I'm looking at the committee. It's chaired by Congressman Nunez, and the ranking member is Congressman Schiff. There are 22 members of the Intelligence Committee. 13 of them are Republican, 9 of them are Democrat. And it raises the question for me, how is this, a committee like this selected, and what's the ability of the party in power to influence the makeup and distribution of a committee like this?
So the Intelligence Committee is a peculiar committee in that it is, you're limited in how many years you can serve on it. You can serve a maximum of 8 years. You are appointed by the leader of your party. So in my case, I was appointed by Nancy Pelosi. Paul Ryan makes all the appointments for the Republicans. The number, the 13 to 9, has to do with how many members of each party are in the House. So let's say if the House, the number of Democrats were to increase next year, but not necessarily take over the House, the numbers on committees shift based on the membership of each party in the House. So, you know, arguably you would see an increase in the number of Democrats on that committee versus Republicans. That committee for the longest time has been a bipartisan body. It's worked very well together. This last year was the first year there has been such acrimony, and oftentimes on the Democratic side, we are blindsided. They do things and it happens in committee, and all of a sudden we're picking up something that we had no warning about. The persons that we are interviewing have to be approved by the majority. So not everyone that we want to interview for this investigation necessarily will be interviewed. So that's how that committee works. Yes.
Thank you very much for your continuous support and your service to our community. Since the Citizens United decision, I've read that $800 million of dark money has flowed into our elections by anywhere from wealthy donors to foreign corporations through political action committees, and these donors don't have to report this. What I'd like to know is, what are you and Congress proposing as legislation to overcome this, And why isn't the Democratic Party promoting this more and pointing out what a disservice to our country this is?
So I mentioned earlier my interest in public financing a campaign. Citizens United was one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. To have John Roberts say that money doesn't corrupt was so naive. And there are a number of bills that I have co-authored. John Sarbanes has the premier bill on trying to undo the Citizens United decision. Disclose is another bill that we have introduced to require at least that there's disclosure of this money that's being spent and by whom. So we're not going to see much success in the next year on that issue. But you're absolutely right. We do not talk about this issue enough. And shame on us for not doing it.
Morning, Congressman. My name is Srini Pattabhiraman. I am part of a grassroots organization called Immigration Voice. I am here to talk about Bill HR 392, Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act. You are a co-sponsor of this bill. We like to thank you for your leadership and your co-sponsors of this bill. The problem is currently we have an arbitrary 7% country cap for employment-based green card, and because of this, high populous countries has a backlog of around 75 years. And people stuck in this backlog, the children that are born outside the country, when they reach 21 years of age, they kind of age out and are forced to leave the country because, when their parents are still waiting for their green card and they are in the backlog. This is breaking up a lot of families in the communities, and we would like to request your leadership on this issue. Since it's affecting the kids, and since the DACA package is something that you are already working on, we request your leadership to add this bill as part of the DACA package. Again, there is an amendment that is proposed to this bill that would bring in around 4 billion in revenue for this, which can help with the DACA expense, whatever it is. We can talk to you in detail after this Townhall.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Speier, are these berries that are these brown papers I have to carry through my whole life? That's without my question. Thank you. These are my frown paper, kind of like somebody that giving you a bad vibe. Yeah, is this something I have to carry? Can you assure me that I can throw these away on my own? Thank you.
Yes, you certainly can.
Thank you for being here. There's a report that the Centers for Disease Control is pulling back its infectious disease monitoring and prevention work in 39 countries because of lack of funding. I'm concerned about not only this, germs don't respect borders, even if Stephen Miller plans to set up some sort of monitoring system. And I'm also concerned about the denigration and the collapse of science and scientists and the lack of support in this country. Thank you.
So one of the ramifications of giving a $2.3 trillion tax cut over the next 10 years to the top 1% is that it's going to shrink the dollars that are going to be made available for everything else. And that's why you're going to see an effort to cut funding for programs like you mentioned at the CDC. In terms of research, that's actually a bright spot, because the grassroots advocacy for NIH, NSA, has been very effective in persuading my Republican colleagues to support an increase of funding for science. So that's the one bright spot in the last couple of years. We've actually augmented the funding for NIH.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for giving us this opportunity to ask a question. My name is Sudhir. This is my wife, Sivani. We would like to thank you for your leadership on immigration-related issues, specifically your co-sponsorship of HR 392, which is the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. As it was mentioned before, this bill helps raise $4 billion, which can be used for other immigration priorities like DACA or any other priorities. We would like to request your leadership to add this bill to any other immigration package like DACA or any other continuing resolution, for example. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've now asked whether or not this will be added to a comprehensive immigration bill. I can't really answer that question because, again, we're not in control. And what we negotiate depends on what they're willing to first put out. It's probably going to be unlikely that that will happen this year. We'll be lucky if we can get DACA fixed. I mean, that's my big concern right now. I'm concerned that that March deadline is going to come and go, and all of a sudden 600,000 young people are going to be illegal, and they're going to be in fear of being able to stay here when they shouldn't be, because we gave them this opportunity to identify themselves, come forward, and be given the ability to go to school and work. So the bill's been introduced. It's got, I don't know how many co-sponsors now, but it does have life. It's just probably going to have to be reintroduced in the next Congress as well. 300 now? Yes.
Hi. Yeah, first of all, we're really lucky to have you, so thanks for being here. I just retired as a federal launching coordinator for EPA after over 30 years, so I have two real specific...
Thank you for your service.
I got to a good time. So, two specific questions. One is, they're going after our own individual EPA employees. EPA itself is going after its own employees under this special boss now. And the second issue is, are you guys going to be able to re-up the oil spill liability trust fund tax? That expired. Are you going to be able to get that going again?
When does it expire?
The oil spill liability trust fund. The tax expired, and it wasn't reauthorized yet. And here on the coast, of course, we're subject to oil spill issues.
So there's a reserve in that fund, though, is there not? Isn't there a reserve in that fund? How large is the reserve?
The fund's got a large reserve, but one large event,
right,
and it goes away. As an example, the Refugio oil spill, I worked on that. Almost $200 million was spent on that cleanup. So everything's very expensive real quick.
Yeah. I can't speak to whether or not it's going to be renewed in this year, but certainly if we can regain the House, there'll be an effort to do that.
Hi, good afternoon, or good morning. My name is Alice Brown, and I want to commend you for all the past good legislation that you have introduced and supported, and especially the newest one, the sex harassment, shortening, making people who have been sexually harassed to report it in a timely manner and easily without further harassment. I have one question. You have signed on to a bill for disabled people, and those laws, I want to question that. Some of those things, provisions, make it more difficult for a disabled person to report. All I want to know is, what is there that I'm not reading?
Okay, so that's a good question, and it may not make sense if you're just listening to one side. So when there's an ADA violation, if a restaurant doesn't have the towel bar at the right height, or the doors aren't large enough for a wheelchair to come in, historically what would happen is a lawsuit would be filed. It would go on for forever. They'd finally negotiate a settlement, and there was never even a requirement that you had to actually fix the problem. And so there were lawyers, this is when I was in the state legislature, there were lawyers in California that just went around and filed hundreds of these lawsuits. So this particular bill would provide that you would have a period, I think it's of 3 months, once they've identified that there is an ADA violation, to repair it. And if you don't repair it, then a lawsuit can be filed. I want it repaired so it's available for the disabled community to use these facilities. And so that's why I supported that bill. But why don't we talk afterwards, okay? Let's get the rest of these questions.
Good morning. I will be brief, although I had prepared this little spiel on Honduras. I'm sure you are aware of what is going on in Honduras. Right now, the inauguration of the illicitly elected one, Orlando Hernandez, is going on in Honduras today, thanks to the political and economic aid of the United States. And we have all this hullabaloo about Russian intervention in US elections, and the United States has intervened in the elections of practically every country in Latin America over the last decades. I want to thank you personally for co-signing the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Bill, the Act HR 1299, which hasn't passed yet, but you are a co-signer. And I want to know, I'll make this brief, what are you going to do to cut off all money to the dictatorship of Juan Carlos Hernandez regime? Thank you.
I think my first concern is making sure that those who are here from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Sudan, who are on what's called a temporary protective status, who have oftentimes been here for over 20 years. 50% of them have been here that long. There are 190,000 US citizens that have been born to persons with these temporary protective status. And about 40% of these people have mortgages, so they have homes here in this country. So the president right now is trying to kick 200,000 El Salvadorians out of their TPS status over the next 18 months. So Honduras is subject to this as well, and Sudan. I've co-signed letters to encourage the administration not to pursue those. In terms of funding for a corrupt regime, that would be coming through the State Department, through the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I do not serve on, but I will be vigilant in looking at what steps are taken to make sure that we're not funding that regime.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity for free speech. I'm amongst a few others who are here who asked you other questions, but from the same organization, Immigration Voice. We have more than 1 million people stuck in green card backlogs. We have aging children. We have employees who are abused by their employers. We have skilled and highly educated people who might leave the country and go outside and start companies and take the jobs away. Thank you for your support and co-sponsorship on HR 392 as well. The current backlog for a green card is taking the time of like 70 years for a person to get a green card. I may be sponsored by my child who's not even born yet. I mean, that's the funny situation right now here. We all hope that there is a clean DACA bill, but if there is not a clean DACA bill happening, would you support attaching HR 392 to DACA?
I would support it if it wouldn't jeopardize DACA. Yeah. Yes.
Good morning, Congresswoman. In terms of gerrymandering, what efforts are being taken to prevent misrepresentation due to that?
So you've probably seen the court cases that have been brought across the country. Most recently in Pennsylvania, where the court found that the gerrymandering was clearly in violation of the law and was intended to create a maximum number of Republican districts and the smallest number of Democratic districts. And so that court, it was a state case, it won't go to the US Supreme Court. That judge basically said that you've got to change these lines this year to affect this election. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Pennsylvania, because it was gerrymandered in a way that created a disproportionate number of Republican districts. That's also the case in North Carolina, but that case is going to the Supreme Court. Florida has some issues as well. So, you know, there was a very sophisticated effort underway during the last cycle of reapportionment, where the Republicans took over most of the state houses in the country. And so they were in a position of power to draw the lines to their advantage. And so they did it. And they did it to the extent that it was an overreach, and that's why these cases are coming to light right now. Ironically, in the Pennsylvania situation, there is one member who has announced he's not going to run for re-election because the sexual harassment settlement had been arranged, and it's now leaked out. And that particular district, which is right now a Republican seat, may be sacrificed, as they refer to it, to rearrange the district. So there'll probably be some pickups for Democrats in Pennsylvania because of it.
Hello, good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you for being here. I am a student. I'm in 8th grade. Actually, this is my school.
You're an 8th grader?
Yes. School shootings and shootings in general, just around, especially this year, it's going to increase. My question is, are there any steps being taken or precautions around gun control, gun safety, and right now?
You know, it breaks my heart to even hear you have to be concerned about that. But you have a right to be concerned about it, because just this week there were 2 shootings in schools. And I think there have been 11 since the beginning of the year. And it has everything to do with the fact that these guns are accessible, they're not locked, they get into the hands of young people that who have issues that then take the action they take. I have been, as you know, a strong proponent of gun violence prevention legislation from the beginning of time. I actually carried the assault weapon ban in the state legislature back in the mid-'80s, I think. There's a funny story about that. I was presenting the bill, and one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle kind of threw up his microphone and said, "Ms. Speier, will you yield?" And I said, "Yes, I yield." He says, "Ms. Speier, I have a question for you. Ms. Speier, have you ever shot an assault weapon?" And I said, "Ms. Speier," and he said it again, "have you ever shot an assault weapon?" And I thought to myself, if you're so stupid to ask me that question, I'm going to give it right back to you. So I said, "No, I haven't. Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been shot by an assault weapon?" That bill sailed off of the assembly floor. It was a bill by then Senator Burley, and I was carrying it on the assembly side. Went to the Republican governor at the time, Pete Wilson, and was signed into law. Look where we've come since then. Look where we've come since then. So I've carried a comprehensive background check bill in the last Congress. I haven't yet reintroduced it this year, but it's important to point out that most guns now are not subject to background checks. Not most, but 40% of them. Because they're bought online, or they're bought by one individual selling to another individual, or they're bought at a gun show. And if we have laws on the books that basically say you should be able to buy a gun if you're a felon, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun if you have committed domestic violence, and you shouldn't be able to buy a gun if you've been a judge mentally unstable. Now, those are simple and logical, and that's the law, but it doesn't apply to sales online or sales between persons or sales at gun shows. And we can't even get that passed in Congress because of the power of the NRA. One more point you should know about the NRA. Guess who was infiltrating the NRA during the 2016 election? Russia. So, enough.
Hello, good morning. Do you have faith that Congress will be able to maybe stop the repeal of net neutrality before it passes? And if it gets
So, as you're probably aware, the FCC has just decided that we're not going to support net neutrality any further. And so there's a bill that's been introduced in Congress. I am one of the co-sponsors of the legislation to reinstate net neutrality. If you hate cable, if you hate what's happened with cable and the fact that we have no power, wait till you see what happens if this net neutrality is kept in place. It is absolutely an abomination, and to think that this FCC did that is profoundly offensive to me and should be to all of you. Okay, one last question. We're done? We're done! All right! Be engaged. This democracy exists because our forefathers and foremothers made sure that they were engaged. And frankly, we've taken it for granted a little bit. It's time to engage, it's time to speak up, and it's time not to give up hope. Thank you.